college, I moved to the Yakima Reservation, which is in central Washington State. And I volunteered with Mending Wings Ministries, which is a nonprofit ministry dedicated to building relationships with Native American youth and young adults. And it was a year-long internship, but halfway through the first year, I realized that the work was so valuable and important that I wanted to stay for a second year. And between year 1 and year 2, this summer, a group of families from my home congregation came and visited me. And that included my spiritual mentor, Lisa. After the second year, it became apparent to me that my time serving on the reservation was over, and I moved back to my hometown of Seattle. Yet I didn't know quite what was next. It was a period of uncertainty and ambivalence, and I was very anxious, wondering why I wasn't hearing from God. During this time in Seattle, I went for a walk with Lisa, and I expressed to her my nostalgia for the res, saying, I felt so close to God there. I had such amazing times of connection and purpose. Lisa said, graciously, thoughtfully, yes, but the res was also a very hard place for you, and I saw you struggling there when I visited. You kind of sound like the Israelites, pining for Egypt. Her comment was spot on. Her memory recalibrated my memory. I was being selective about the past because of my insecurity about the present. I was only remembering the good parts. My desire to return to the res had nothing to do with the res itself, actually. It had to do with my partiality towards what was comforting and comfortable, what was familiar. I wanted to go back to a known place, even though I knew that it was not where God would have me in this season. So I can relate with the Israelites, especially as they are described in Exodus 17. The Israelites, too, were selective in their memory about the past because of their insecurity about the present. In this passage, the Israelites asked Moses, why did you bring us out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst? They complain. They doubt. They are fearful and impatient. As modern readers, we may criticize them for their lack of faith, or we could dismiss them altogether. But I would conjecture that there is some resemblance, even though we are not identical to them. I would like us to find ourselves in this story. And when we do so, we discover, we acknowledge that we all experience desert. Also, we all experience thirst. We all at times experience circumstances that overwhelm and frustrate us. And by God's grace, we all experience the power, provision, and presence of the Lord. Exodus 17, 1-7 is one of many accounts of Moses and the Israelites in transition, and the people gripe and object to the current conditions. Since this church is going through the narrative lectionary right now, you all have been immersed in the story of how Yahweh has called and empowered Moses to lead the people from slavery to liberation, how the Lord has delivered them out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, how God has parted the Red Sea miraculously so that the people could walk on dry land. The Holy One went in front of them in a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night to give them light and direction. God made bitter water sweet, and God sent manna from heaven and quail to eat for meat. But traveling through the desert is tough, and the wilderness can cause people to be myopic sometimes. They are unable to see God's kindness and generosity, unable to trust that the God who saved them yesterday will have the power and the desire to save them today. The sand, the dirt, the physical bleakness, the isolation, the instability, it gets to them. It gets to us. When I was less mature in my faith, I made the assumption that if I followed God, obeying Jesus as best as I could, I wouldn't have to go through times of wilderness. But now that I have matured somewhat, I realize that the wilderness is not always a direct consequence of sin. It is sometimes inevitable, normal. There is a time for harvest, for lush abundance, and there are times that the ground stays fallow, bare. All of God's children go through times of being in the desert. We inhabit places of wilderness. We venture through terrain that is uncharted. As believers, the journey that we are on is long. We will trek up mountains and climb down valleys. There will be times that our shepherd will lead us beside quiet waters and wide rivers. And there will be other seasons where we will be in an arid and barren land, the rough country, and the shepherd is there with us as well. I recently read a book called Wild by Cheryl Strayed, a nonfiction account of being a 26-year-old woman hiking the Pacific Crest Trail alone, ill-equipped and woefully inexperienced. She packs her backpack too heavy and with unnecessary gear. She hikes in hiking shoes that are too small for her, losing toenails and developing severe blisters as a result. And one day in California, she hikes through a particularly dry segment of the trail, walking in the 100+ degree heat, trying not to think about how hot and thirsty she is. At around 4:30 in the afternoon, she calculated that she was 3 miles away from the water tank on the trail. She had 8 ounces of water left, then 6, then 4. She forced herself not to drink the last 2 ounces until she had the water tank in sight. And she wrote, "As soon as I saw it, I pulled out my water and drank the last of my water, thankful that in a matter of minutes, I'd be able to drink my fill from the tank." As she got closer to the tank, however, she saw that there were tiny scraps of paper duct taped to the tank. They all bore the same message: no water. She wrote, "I stood motionless for a moment, paralyzed with dread. I gazed into the tank to confirm what was true. There was no water. I had no water. Not even a sip. No water, no water, no water, no water." Furious at herself, terrified, Cheryl read her guidebook and resolved to hike another 5 miles up to get to a reservoir, though the guidebook advised against drinking from it because the quality was, quote, questionable at best. But Cheryl was desperate. When she finally got to the reservoir, she was relieved that it had not gone dry, though it was a miserable-looking mucky pond about the size of a tennis court. She used her water purifier and iodine pills and waited 30 minutes for the pills to do their work on her 2 bottles. She was exhausted and severely dehydrated. She was usually hungry at dinner time on the trail, but this day, she didn't want to eat anything. Her only desire was water. After the 30 minutes had passed, she drank 1 bottle down, then the other, writing, "The warm water tasted like iron and mud, and yet seldom have I ever consumed anything so amazing." Cheryl was desperate, and desperation made her willing to adjust her expectations of what constitutes drinkable water, what is refreshing. Her thirst had been blinding, and I imagine her persistent refrain as she hiked to the reservoir was, "No water, no water, no water." Now, I hope that none of you have experienced the extent to which Cheryl had physical thirst. But we all have thirsted, be it physically, materially, socially, spiritually. I wonder if there is anyone of us right now who hears a panicky refrain in our heads, "No water, no water." We experience wilderness, and we experience thirst. Some of us have a prolonged sickness, and we thirst for a clear diagnosis and improved health. Some of us are underemployed or unemployed, and we thirst for meaningful work and economic stability. Some of us are lonely and suffering from loss and broken relationships, and we thirst for companionship and intimacy. Some of us are part of a community that is hurting, and we thirst for resolution and leadership and wisdom. In the desert, our sense of thirst is heightened, intense, and we feel desperate. The Israelites certainly felt desperate with thirst. And in their desperation, they got angry. They expected there to be something to drink. In their desperation, they got reckless. Egypt seemed preferable to this precarious situation. In their desperation, they focused chiefly on their sense of scarcity. When they were in the chains of slavery, they hadn't experienced thirst like this. They were blinded and frightened. The wording in verse 1 indicates that the Israelites did not choose to camp at Rephidim. It was the Lord that commanded them there. So it seems like God had led them directly to a place where there was no drinkable water. One commentator estimates that it was approximately mid-June, the beginning of summer, when the Israelites arrived at Rephidim, and they were by a stream bed. But given the time of year, it was the dry season, and the stream had already dried up. Perhaps they felt it cruel. Here in their desperation, there was a stream bed, but no streams of water. Their quarreling, their test of God, is rooted in fear and anxiety. They are afraid that God won't provide for their needs. Certainly, God hasn't provided them with water in the stream bed, the natural place they'd expect water to be. The Lord wasn't conforming to their expectations of how to supply for their basic necessities. They felt incredibly threatened and vulnerable. Not only would they die, but their children and their livestock would too. And Moses, too, feared for his life. When he cried out to God, he wasn't crying out for the lack of water. He was crying out that the people wanted to stone him, to kill him in protest of his leadership. He felt threatened and apprehensive. In this instance, he is not interceding for the people and their request. He is paying attention to his own welfare. Moses looks like a person afraid of losing his life for doing his job. Like the people, he was desperate and unsure about God's provision for him. Mercifully, God does not get angry with Moses or the people. Instead, the Lord acts. The Lord provides. The Lord is powerful. And the Israelites and Moses have done nothing to deserve it. In Exodus 17, God did not merely allow the Israelites to find water in an ordinary way, but showed them extraordinary provision by supplying that water in a place that it would otherwise not be available, from a rock at the base of the mountain of God. The Lord upends their expectations. It is a divine gift, a miracle. In order for any miracle to take place, God's presence and power are required. And Yahweh explicitly promised Moses divine presence, saying, "I will stand there before you by the rock at Horeb." God gives Moses very specific instructions. Moses is to use the staff that he used to strike the Nile. That is, the staff that removed drinkable water from Egypt during the plagues and Pharaoh's hardening heart. This same staff would now make drinkable water flow from out of a rock. Yes, the desert is a hostile place, but God has authority over these wastelands, just as God had authority over Egypt. God is in control. Note that after God's very specific instructions, in verse 6, we learn that Moses did what he was told. But that's it. There's no description of the water, no report on the people's change of heart after this miracle, no story of the people breaking into songs of praise and thanksgiving. The story seems incomplete to me. I want the conclusion to be a description of the people, contrite yet happy, enjoying the unconventional way that the Lord had provided for their basic needs. But what we have for the conclusion is Moses naming the place Meribah and Massah, because the people had tested the Lord and protested their circumstances. It wasn't just that the people had asked, "Why doesn't the Lord give us water? What is God's intention for bringing us out of Egypt into the desert if we are to die here?" No. Scripture says what they asked was, is the Lord among us or not? They doubted God's very presence. They did not believe that God was real and really with them. But in the face of the people's unfaithfulness, God's faithfulness prevailed. The Israelites' complaints were unfounded. God hadn't abandoned them. Yes, the stream beds at Rephidim were completely dried up, but God did not allow them, God's people, to dry up and perish. The people had thought that God's presence with them meant total immunity from the hazards of existence, time, and environment. And perhaps we make that same assumption at times too, but that's simply not the reality of our life in Christ. Living in safe neighborhoods, sending our kids to good schools, diligently stowing away money in a 401k retirement account, these things do not make us immune from suffering. We experience times of wilderness, desert, and spiritual dryness. We thirst, we need, but hear the good news. The Lord is among us. The Lord will provide for our needs in surprising ways and from unexpected sources, like water from a rock. The Lord doesn't necessarily conform to our expectations of how to provide, but the Lord provides with divine power and presence. God is unexpected and good. God is real and really with us. I was singing "Great is Thy Faithfulness" at church in late August, and I was overcome with emotion as I sang the line, "All I have needed, Thy hand hath provided," because it was so true. This is my testimony. Sure, I am undergoing some difficult circumstances, but to the question, is the Lord among us or not? Is the Lord here? My answer is an unequivocal and resounding yes. The Danish philosopher Kierkegaard wrote that life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. And so that is my encouragement for all of us this morning. We can look back and we can remember how God has acted with grace and compassion, with patience and power in the past, but we press on, anticipating God's goodness and faithfulness in our present and in our future. In the desert, in the thirst, in trying and stressful situations, the Lord who caused water to flow out of a rock will do whatever it takes to provide us with what we really need. The Lord is among us. Thanks be to God. Pray with me.